You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Good morning. This week on the Open Door, we discuss once more what makes for good teaching and learning, especially in the context of the liberal arts. Jim Hanink here with my fellow panelists, Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Our special guest is the distinguished educator Lee S. Shulman. He is Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus, Stanford University, and President Emeritus, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Yes, we have some questions for him. But first, as always, we begin with a prayer today that Jews and Catholics share. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words, which I command thee this day, shall be upon thy heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and thou shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Professor Shulman, in your essay, seminal work, Making Differences, a Table of Learning, you explore the role of categories. Jacques Maritain, who had friends at the University of Chicago, urged again and again that we distinguish to unite. I think that fits in with the idea of categories. How do categories help us?
Well, I don't think that we can do much in the way of thinking without categories, because categories emerge as soon as people begin to make distinctions. And I've always been struck by the fact that the Bible that you just quoted from begins with the claim that when the creation began, God made a distinction between night and day, light and darkness. And you read those first chapters of Genesis, and the creation involves heaven and earth being divided. I mean, man being distinguished from woman, from the beasts of the earth. I think the logical and epistemological lesson, even of the first books of the Bible, is that without distinctions, the world remains what in Hebrew is called tohu vavohu, just a kind of mess. So it's the way we make our way, Jim. And in fact, may I tell you a little story? I'm asking permission, sir.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, and at the University of Chicago there technically are no majors because you really are studying mainly philosophy and the great books. And my future brother-in-law, who was a med student, and med students always know exactly what they're going to do, had coffee with me. I was 20, and he said, "Lee, what is it that you're majoring in?" And I said, "I think philosophy." And he said, "Oh, remember now, this is a future physician." And he said, "What do philosophers do?" Well, that question never occurred to me. And so I responded after a long pause, philosophers make distinctions. Well, that was a conversation stopper. He went on to advise me not to continue my relationship with his sister because as a philosophy major coming from a poor family, I'd never be able to support his sister in the manner to which she'd grown accustomed. She then was already 18. Well, we've been married 60 years, and thank the Lord, I've been making distinctions and getting paid for it. And not as a philosopher necessarily, but as a psychologist, as a university teacher, as a foundation administrator. Making distinctions goes a long way. And Mr. Maritain had a fine insight.
Well, all I can say is you're right. And let me share with you my failure to make a distinction. My good wife of 52 years and I were with a group of seniors, more senior than we are. And well, you know, sometimes seniors prepare and sometimes they don't. So we said, now, we're still in our 70s, so, well, there might come a day, now, it's not here yet, but there might come a day when we'll be considering assisted living. And my wife says, consider it, you've been living in it for 52 years.
The women of the world have been doing that kind of
now, Mario and Christopher, I want you to quiz this worthy guest of ours.
You first, Mario.
Well, it's interesting the word distinction.
A little louder, Mario, please.
Yes.
Más fuerte, hombre, más fuerte.
It's important, the word distinction, that Maritain use very often. However, at the same time, that word got him into trouble more than once. There is a long history of his distinction between the individual and the person, which led some people to believe that he was a dualist. And that dualism has a lot of repercussion in politics, as if one individual was of one piece privately and another publicly. So my question to you is there any special attitude or courtesan or way of thinking in order to be more sensitive to distinction, or just think in more broader terms?
Well, that's a powerful and important question, Mario. When I was interacting with Jim prior to this, he observed that one of the observations that I have liked the most is that of Whitehead, who said, "Seek generalizations and distrust them." And I think that kind of dialectical thinking, in which on the one hand you're making distinctions because it's the only way to move forward, but at the same time you're in a state of mind that recognizes that all distinctions have a certain arbitrary, artificial character about them, and you better be wary of taking them too seriously. I spent about 10 years of my career as a psychologist studying medical thinking. How did physicians make diagnoses? Now recognize, a medical diagnosis is a set of categories. We walk into a doctor's office as a mess of feelings and of aches and pains and worries and whatever. And the job of the physician is to take what it is we're complaining about and put them in a set of categories that are called diagnoses. And the notion of, there's a root in there that I suspect is Greek or Latin that you folks know better than I, that is a form of knowledge. The diagnosis is coming to know something. But one of the things that we saw as we studied how physicians learn to think, and we were doing that because we wanted to redesign medical school curricula. We wanted to teach future physicians to be even better at this, was that the whole history that they take, the physical exam, the labs, are designed to systematically, in a disciplined way, be skeptical about their initial hypotheses. And so the thought process of physicians is a combination of distinctions and distrusting them, and trying to do it with evidence. And so I think the essence of a liberal education, is to teach students to look at the mess of the world around them. And sometimes that mess is the text of a textbook that makes certain claims in sort of dogmatic, in a dogmatic sense. There's nothing that is a more blatant lie than the sentences in textbooks, because they assert a certainty that never should be there. And a liberally educated person is someone who can examine those kinds of texts and statements, can generate several ways of making sense of them, and then learn to interrogate them all. And that's not easy to do. That's why liberal education is a very uncomfortable activity, because it complicates our worlds for us. But goodness knows it's also an absolutely, indispensably valuable one.
All right, Christopher.
I'm curious.
And by the way, excuse me for talking so long. I will try to keep my responses much shorter.
We're here to chew the fat.
You use the term categories. What I think a lot of people listening might want to know what you mean by categories. It seems that there can be kind of categories which are arbitrary or just things we kind of create, or if people has a sense of a category as being merely a name that we impose upon things, which name is not necessarily present in reality, or it's actually a means of by which we access reality. What do you mean? Do you mean categories like in the sense of Aristotle's 10 categories, or are you talking about something broader? And what relation do those categories have to reality?
You're asking a very difficult epistemological question, my friend.
That's my job.
my bachelor's thesis, which I wrote in 1959 when I was 21.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. The title of that thesis, which I think is what scared the hell out of my future brother-in-law, was Theories of Perception in Freud, Hume, Kant, and Hegel. How's that for a bestseller, guys? And it was, I had a tutorial with a philosopher of education named Harold Dunkel at the University of Chicago, who was a classicist. And we spent the year. I was fascinated by Freud. I was soon to become a psychologist in graduate school. And Dunk said, you know, you'll have to understand that psychology is basically an attempt to make the fundamental philosophical views on how people engage with the world more tangible empirically, and so you better learn those philosophies. And so, of course, the question of where do these categories come from? Are we somehow apprehending the way the world in and of itself is organized, or are we making sense of the world by inventing categories? I tend to lean toward the second view. As a psychologist, and as somebody who has studied medical thinking, the way in which teachers make sense of their students as well as of the subjects they're teaching, I've always been struck by the power that we have as teachers, as learners, as human beings, to make sense of the world by making distinctions. Sometimes we've learned to make them, other times we invent them on the spot. But I do think that we impose them on the world. I have to stop short of absolute idealism, but I do this intuitively, not systematically. So Jim has observed in one of his questions for me that I like Clifford Geertz's famous aphorism that, this is an aphorism that I think of as so seriously that I've got it on the wall of my study. I had it on the wall of my office. And it's, man is an animal suspended in webs of meaning he himself has spun. And I have that on my wall beneath a sculpture of a spider spinning webs. That the cultural milieu in which we live, the milieus in which we live, the religious, the political, the familial, the culinary, if you will, are webs that are meaningful because we as a species have spun them. And like any web, they have the advantage of giving us locomotion. Spiders move so rapidly on the webs that they've woven. It makes that progress, that learning possible, that problem solving possible. At the same time, webs are traps. They are designed not only to make movement possible, but to create traps. And that's true of all the webs of meaning that we create as our categories. They make it possible for us to move, but it is very, very easy to become trapped in our own webs. As one of my teachers once said, beware of the hardening of the categories.
That's an interesting quote. I'm thinking that we have to be aware of them, right? Is it we have to be aware of them because we might not act or work effectively, or do we have to be aware of them, wary of them because they might not actually correspond to reality. I'm thinking, I think our senses, like for instance, having moved from California to Ohio, we're surrounded by trees.
Oh, it's a great loss. A great loss.
But we're surrounded by trees on all sides, so the first thing you notice is a kind of unity, right? You notice trees. But then you begin to observe trees, you begin to notice the distinctions between them, which is fascinating. But the more you recognize the distinction between the trees, the better your sense is that you know them. Now, you might be mistaken as to whether something's a gum tree or a maple, but that would be a false categorizing, or a false uniting of things in a false category, or a true category, but a mistake as to what applies to that category. But yet the sense is that we're accessing reality, which is our apprehension of it being truth. Is it that is the danger, is that we might not reach truth, or is that we might not properly be able to control the natural processes around us? Is it power that we're looking for, or is it knowledge?
Well, I would say knowledge, but I'd also say that knowledge is power in this sense. The interesting thing about these categories, before you left California, how long ago did you leave California?
3 years ago.
He could recover. See, he could recover still.
I was going to say that, although I'd watch out for planes, but we moved to California. I'm a Midwesterner, born and raised in Chicago. All my education in that fair city, through the doctorate, and then spent nearly 20 years in Michigan before coming here to California 38 years ago. And when you were there, did you ever go to Point Lobos in Carmel?
Oh, yes, it's one of my... We went there on our honeymoon, and we went there shortly before we moved. It's one of my favorite places.
Well, I say to Jim, to all of your listeners, before you die, find a way to get to Point Lobos. It may be the most beautiful natural site in the world. But there's an important lesson, I guess, in Point Lobos. Some of the most famous trees in Point Lobos are cypress trees that grow and are shaped by the winds and the moisture of this point that extends out into the Pacific. Actually, I guess into Monterey Bay. And the wind, the behavior of the wind is such that those cypress trees, hundreds of them, no two are alike. The wind, kind of the battering of reality, if you will, has shaped each of them to be as distinctive as our fingerprints, or apparently the irises of our eyes. And so you see, when you're on Point Lobos, the fundamental, if you will, conundrum of category, which is the category tree, or in this case cypress, identifies that kind of tree and distinguishes it from all others. But there are no two cypresses that are actually alike. So the category both is a distinction that works well, it works for us, and if you want to say, well, it's true because it correctly describes a part of the natural world, at the same time, there isn't a single cypress on Point Lobos that is the cypress tree of our Aristotelian imaginations. And so I think that captures seek the generalization and recognize that it is essentially and ultimately and irretrievably wrong. And yet it's really useful.
Well, there's a ton of philosophy, and you just added a ton more, and I'm sure our gentle listeners, eventually these engagements will be transcribed for readers, but I'm sure they want to hear about other things, and yet, there's no need to rush. No need to rush. I want to begin with the sign that you have on your wall. Mario and I are very familiar with a famous Thomist who left us recently, Ralph McInerney of Notre Dame. And in his spare time, he only slept 4 hours a day. In his spare time, he wrote detective stories. At any rate, on his wall, he had a sign that said, "No one owes you a reading. No one owes you a reading," which I thought was a very good sign that a lot of us could put on our walls. But now, I think we're 100% with you when you say we have to be wary of webs turning into bubbles, and we have to be wary of webs turning into echo chambers. That's certainly the case. And you might be with us when we say everything is what it is and not another thing. Everything is what it is and not another thing. And I know that you are an advocate of applying taxonomies, applying systems of categories to our own activities. We like to categorize what other people are doing, but you warn us that we need to categorize in a constructive way what we are doing. So you're looking for truth, right? And you're not an absolute idealist.
My lantern is long since burned out, so I probably stop short of that, but go ahead.
All right, you have been looking for truth, and you want us to believe that what you say is true, even if you're not looking for truth. Could you apply some of your taxonomies to your own work? And give us an example of how we might apply taxonomies to our own work.
Okay, well, let me perhaps as a final philosophical observation, and then returning to the turf that I'm much more comfortable with, which is the concrete demands of pedagogy. But I observed a long time ago that if you asked me, as an educator, philosophically, where would you place yourself? And I'd say, I'm a Deweyan. John Dewey is across the wall from the Spider of Geertz is the photograph of John Dewey surrounded by a group of children that I got as a gift when I gave the annual John Dewey lecture to the American Educational Research Association. And so Dewey's great antagonist was Aristotle. If you read Dewey's Logic, he begins with an attack on Aristotle.
Go ahead. I'm tough. I could take it.
There you go. And what I've had to realize is that I may be a Deweyan pedagogically, in the sense that Dewey believes that the kind of knowledge that really sticks with people is knowledge that they have actively invented, discovered, not what they sat in some lecture hall or classroom and absorbed as, this must be true, the teacher told me so. That it's only an act of, my first book was called Learning by Discovery. And so I'm a Deweyan, if you ask me. On the other hand, if you read almost anything I've written, I'm an Aristotelian.
It all comes out in the end.
Well, it's and so was Mortimer Adler. The joke used to be at the University of Chicago is that the University of Chicago is a place where a faculty of atheists teaches Catholic philosophy to a student body of Quakers and Jews.
Now that's diversity for you. That's diversity.
Well, you know, my twin pillars in those days were Aquinas on the one hand and Maimonides on the other, both powerful Aristotelians. So, but let's just say something about the taxonomies. One of my mentors in graduate school was a man named Benjamin Bloom. Benjamin Bloom was concerned that teachers were much too comfortable passing knowledge on to students and then testing, either orally or in writing, to see if the students could repeat back to the teacher the knowledge that had been transmitted. And Bloom said, you know, the problem is the teachers don't understand that what they call knowledge is actually the lowest level of a hierarchy of forms of understanding that go much further. And they've got to get some categories in their heads that will serve as a kind of, not checklist, but a mnemonic irritant, as it were, that would ask them, have I taught them what I should be teaching them? And so he created what in the field of education is perhaps the most widely used taxonomy in the world. It starts with knowledge, which is basically that which students can repeat back. It goes through understanding, analysis, synthesis, critical review and revision. I mean, he has a set of categories, and the specific ones are less important than the notion that when you teach and when you assess your students, neither you nor they can ever permit yourselves to be satisfied with the lowest level of the taxonomy. You must always be asking, can't I go higher than this? Can't I elevate their knowledge to a higher level? And if you can internalize that kind of taxonomy, it can become a way of inspiring and disciplining your teaching in ways that will ultimately benefit your students in manifold ways. Well, there's a concrete example. All over the world, I was on a Chinese commune somewhere in the rural part of China many years ago. I think it was 1980. And I saw a big bulletin board that all the teachers would see as they walked into the school. And it was all in Chinese, so I couldn't understand it, but it had one word at the top in English, and it was the word bloom. Then I looked beneath it, and I realized it had to be Bloom's taxonomy in Chinese to remind those teachers that just teaching repeatable dogma was not sufficient. And of course, they were Marxists. To be a Marxist is to be Hegelian in your forms of thought. Hegel was a kind of Deweyan idealist, even though he was alive much earlier than Dewey. But you can see that set of categories was so powerful pedagogically in guiding what teachers taught and what students learned. And it was also a trap.
That's a terrific story. True story. Very, very, very interesting. Mario, now our guest wants to turn towards more concrete things, and since you're the teacher...
Thank you. The air is getting very thin here in Palo Alto. Let's go for it.
Since you're the teacher, Mario, who's teaching, why don't you push and prod a little bit on concrete questions?
And Mario, first tell us what you're teaching.
philosophy.
That's much too broad. Is it an introduction to philosophy?
Yes.
Is it a class on Kant or Thomas or?
Both, history of philosophy generally. But this is my question.
Yes, sir.
It's interesting your remark that you are disciple of Dewey and Aristotle. Let's talk about engagement. One of the features that I have been observing over the past 5 years among students is precisely the lack of engagement. Mm-hmm. They look passive. They don't seem to be interested about nothing. There is a sense of skepticism of whatever you want to say. So for them, knowledge is out there, and they don't care much other than learning something and take the test. So it seems that there is a divorce, you may want to call distinction, between the content of your class, your message, and the way by which you are conveying that knowledge. And what is failing, that's my impression, is precisely that we don't know exactly how to convey that knowledge. So students may be listening, but they don't feel engaged. That knowledge is not part of their life. So my question to you is, now, I understand your point, say, well, then you need to allow or teach the student to experience the knowledge you are conveying so that they can be engaged in what you are proposing. Now, the question is this pedagogical aspect of teaching, that knowledge, a technique, something that you learn, or it's something that you as a teacher have as a part of your vocation? In other words, do you teach just by learning that technique or just showing who you are with your life? It's a question of mimesis or a question of something that you learn and teach? Wanted to hear.
Yeah, well, when you use the term mimesis or imitation, that, of course, was the bête noire that Bloom was attacking. That was the misunderstanding that what you're trying to get students to acquire is knowledge in that passive, repetitive, mimetic sense. No, I would say, Mario, that the more you use the word convey, the more trapped we become as teachers. I spent much of my career trying to make a distinction, if you will, between the notion of content knowledge, something you try to convey, and what I call pedagogical content knowledge, which is an understanding of what you're trying to teach, which is only complete if you place it in the context of what must be going on in the heads of the students. And of course, all students are not alike, so you've got to think of their diversity and their variety that can serve as a kind of Velcro, if you will, that will connect to aspects of what it is I'm teaching about. And so these are not techniques. I think the notion that somehow pedagogy is a set of tricks that teachers learn to use to get students engaged. They tell funny stories, and they either do or don't call on students without warning, or the trick of having students work in collaborative small groups. the tricks, they look like tricks, but they aren't, because what the teachers have to understand is, how do I figure out what's going on in the minds of the students so that I can connect the philosophy of Aristotle, and is it the physics, is it the ethics, is it the poetics? I mean, which pieces am I working with the experiences, the minds, the hearts of the students, so that it doesn't become conveyance, it becomes something they reach out to and engage with more actively. One of my students, Pamela Grossman, many years ago, wrote a dissertation that became a book called The Making of a Teacher. And she studied how A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens was taught by some graduate students in literature who had no preparation as teachers, and some graduate students in literature who had had a full year of preparation through mentoring, through study, through practice, to learning to become a teacher of literature. And she said, what's the difference between them? And what she found was very simple. The first group began with Dickens. The second group began with the students. They thought actively about what's going on in the students' heads, or what can I place there through simulations, through case studies, through a variety of ways that will create a bond between the student's active interest and what makes a difference in the text. And I think that's where I'm a Deweyan, if you will, because that's Dewey's question. How can you psychologize the subject matter so that the Aristotle or the Shakespeare or the McKeon or the contemporary politics becomes not a kind of dead weight to be conveyed, but an active part of the student's mind and heart? That's what teaching is.
Mario, pick up on that?
Well, it's very interesting. There is in other words, there is a distinction you are making between engagement and teacher's tricks or technique. If that is the case, then the teacher must have a vocation for teaching. It's an example, set an example for the students. Now, there is an old expression that we get in the Catholic tradition from Catholic Action, which was a movement begun in the 30s and 40s, which was the precursor of Christian democracy to some extent. So they held a motto, which was very interesting and was widespread, this motto, mainly in Latin America, which says, first observe, second act, and then judge. What do you think about this motto? Is there any resemblance of what you are saying with what is expressed by this motto? Observe, act, and judge.
I love the motto. I did not know the motto. I learned it from Jim in an email last week. Thank you, Jim.
De nada. Go ahead.
Well taught, sir. And I guess I would add, just to give myself a little credential, if you will, that for a number of years I served as chair of the advisory committee for the Alliance for Catholic Education, whose center was Notre Dame University in South Bend. And I had a lot of explaining to do about my rabbi about why I was spending my time as chair of that advisory board. I assured him that it was time very well spent. So I'm familiar with some of the challenges of preparing teachers, in the case of ACE, for teaching in urban Catholic schools. Enormously diverse. In fact, many of the Catholic schools, half the kids aren't Catholic. And so with respect to the observe, act, judge, I think that's lovely. Notice it begins with observe. And I think that means find out what's going on in the lives and minds and experiences of the students. Keep your mouth shut. As one of my colleagues once said, when you really learn to teach, you realize that teaching is mainly about listening. Learning is about talking. You can only observe by having the students talk, write. In many classes I had the students write a 2-page autobiography before we even began class, so I'd get a sense of what their lives were like. Observe as a first step is powerful. If you don't observe, you'll never figure out how very smart the students already are, because you've listened to them, you've watched them, you've taken them very seriously, which is why you then act in a manner that seems to be responsive and sympathetic and empathic and in tune with what you now think you understand about the students. But notice, and Mario, I'm sure you would agree, acting is not done in the dark. As you act, you continue to observe. You continue to watch. And probably the person you've got to observe most carefully, skeptically, and judgmentally is yourself. What are you saying? What are you doing? What kind of role model are you offering to the students? But you must act. And so action and observation are not necessarily sequential. They have a kind of dynamic simultaneity and interactivity and responsiveness, which is where judgment comes in. To me, judgment is often reflection. It is, what the heck is going on here? Are the students saying things that are so much smarter than anything I thought they might understand that I can get smarter about what's going on too? So I would say the 3 pieces of that motto, or if you will, a kind of taxonomy of aspects of teaching, is that like the taxonomy I offered in the paper that Jim made reference to at the beginning of the hour, the categories have a hierarchy, but at the same time they're interacting with one another in such a powerful sense that they change places. Judgment is always going on, even as you observe, and you've got to act constantly, and the students are always acting. So I love the motto. I don't know that I'm going to put it on my wall next to the Geertz, but I'll keep it in mind.
Well, let me interject here an adage and an anecdote. And I think the adage connects very well with some of what we've been discussing.
You're becoming homiletical, and it's one of my favorite forms of communication. So go for it.
I'm homely enough to be homiletical. At any rate, a teacher colleague of mine who sadly died just a couple of years ago like to say the first thing is to render notice the verb, render the students docibile, make the student teachable. And there are a lot of ways of doing that. Now, here's the anecdote. This is a true story. Samuel Johnson, who had a real sense of place, Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson of the dictionary, didn't like to travel. And his biographer constantly urged him to travel. And finally he did. He went to, he actually made a series of trips, but the first one was to Paris. And there he was introduced to Voltaire, and Voltaire didn't speak English, and Johnson, far be it from him to speak French. So what did they do? They spoke in Latin. And after some time, Voltaire said in Latin, "Sir, your Latin is admirable, exemplary, very good." And Johnson said to Voltaire in Latin, "Why, sir, it should be so. My master beat me very well." So that's the direct approach. Christopher, we're running towards the end of the hour, so now's the time to raise some more issues.
Go for it,
well,
Christopher,
I don't know.
please.
I thought that Mario said about the observe, act, and judge. And I think what you're saying is that those things are not in a strict order, because in order to act, you do have to judge, right? You do, so as you're observing, you are constantly judging. What do you think too about this? I mean, I think one of the things that a teacher can do is model the process of thought that students should go through. I think when I was in college, I had a professor who, we had seminar-style classes, but he was an older professor, and he tended to do more towards the lecturing. We were reading Aristotle, and sometimes it was very frustrating for us because he was pretty heavy-handed, but he died halfway through the year, and we got another teacher who didn't know Aristotle quite as well, but yet we found that when we had the new teacher, we were actually able to read Aristotle with
you could actually what?
Interpret Aristotle, because we were modeling how our teacher approached it. So where does that come into the actual? I mean, I could see in this sense how lecture style in a classroom is important, because what it does is it teaches the student how to approach a text, or at least gives an example of how to approach a text. And so in that way, there's a kind of docility that has to be in the student in order to actually, in a sense, imitate what the teacher is doing.
Well, boy, there's so much there. Can we have another hour, Jim?
Well, in a couple of weeks, you're coming back, right? Didn't you already agree to that? You didn't read the fine print.
I come back
you didn't read the fine print.
I'll charge twice as much as I'm charging this morning.
Well, that's all right. I can work with that.
But in any event, Chris, the one of the most memorable lessons in my experience as an undergrad, and I've written about it, was the first day of class, in a class on, it doesn't matter what the topic is, but we were starting with Aristotle's physics and talk about distinctions, the teacher looked at me. I was sitting in the front row, a very dangerous place to sit. His name was Joseph Schwab. He was had a PhD in mathematical genetics, and had become a philosopher. Another story. And he said, "Read out loud," which sounds like a terribly didactic thing to say. And I read, "Of things that exist," book 2 of the physics, "some exist by nature and some from other causes." And as I began to read the next line, Schwab interrupted me and said, "What the hell is Aristotle doing there?" And I proceeded to try to paraphrase what Aristotle was saying. And he interrupted me, scared the hell out of me. He said, "I didn't ask what he's saying. I asked, what is he doing?" Well, that went on for about 10 minutes. The others in class around me are sweating almost as profusely as I am, and I'm sure saying, but for the grace of God, I could have been Shulman. And, I mean, and finally, he broke through. He didn't tell me. But he said, "What? When I ask not what is he saying, what is he doing, there's a difference there." What? And I thought to myself, oh my God, and this is maybe the first time I use these words, he's making a distinction between things that exist for different reasons. He said, right, Aristotle is beginning one of the most important books of his writings with a distinction. In fact, if you read through this and don't get caught up in the mistake of what is he saying, but what he's actively doing, only then will you begin to understand Aristotle. Now, notice what he was doing. He was, by the way, he was smiling. He was periodically saying, "Relax. This is not easy. Work at it." But he didn't let other students jump in. He said, "We've got to let Lee work on this by himself, but the rest of you work on it with him." He was modeling the notion that if you want to understand a text, you've got to remember that the text was written by somebody who must have had a reason for writing it. You've got to interrogate the writer and the writing. What the hell are they doing if you're going to even have a slim chance of understanding the text? Well, let me tell you, folks, first of all, those weren't tricks. Because if you've ever tried to teach Socratically, you know how very difficult it is. You know how deeply you've got to understand the text yourselves, how carefully you've got to listen to everything the student says, and how gently and even when you're being harsh and caringly, you want to make sure the students don't fall apart. And that was a combination of role modeling. Look what I'm doing to the text. Do it yourself. Try, and it was all those things. But he was paying enormous attention to me, and at the same time teaching me how to engage with a piece of text. And boy, I've gone on too long there, Chris. But
no, and I can see why you've gone to write about that as well. That's a powerful story. Let me more or less close with a couple of questions.
Sure, Jim.
Set the stage.
Again, I apologize for
yes, please.
so long. It's talking so long. Go ahead, please. Jim, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
I thought Mario wanted to.
Oh, I see. I didn't know where the questions were coming from.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm still here. Never go away. Much the same for now. Let me go ahead to 2 points that will set the stage for Professor Shulman's return engagement. You emphasize the balance between the cognitive and the affective, and you talk about how the various acts of categorization and their development into full-blown taxonomies can't harden, that there's a kind of movement within the taxonomy, and we can't lose sight of that. And because of that, there's a kind of a unity in learning, and a unity in teaching. Now, there's a Thomistic adage, operare sequitur esse, and the rough translation would be the acts, the operations, say the operations of a teacher, the operations of the learner, they follow the to be of who's engaging in all of these acts. So we approach the being of Professor Shulman and our own being and the being of the other in terms of their acts. Now, if that's so, if there's a point of unity for these various actions, what is it? What is it? And then the very last question would be, if there is a point of unity for these various acts, and that point of unity is the human person, well, then the next question is that human person capax Dei? Can we say of these extraordinary acts which you eloquently and instructively present to us in the context of learning, can we say that the person who engages in these acts has a capacity for the divine? And we'll certainly return to these questions, and I'll end with the way we always end. We began with a prayer. We always begin with a prayer. I'll end with the gospel for the day, which is a gospel based on a commemoration of John the Baptizer. This is from Luke. When the time arrived for Elizabeth to have her child, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy toward her, and they rejoiced with her. When they came on the 8th day to circumcise the child, they were going to call him Zechariah after his father. But his mother said in reply, "No, he will be called John." But they answered her, "There's no one among your relatives who has this name." So they made signs, asking his father what he wished him to be called. He asked for a tablet and wrote, "John is his name." And all were amazed. Immediately his mouth was opened, his tongue freed, and he spoke, blessing God. Then fear came upon all their neighbors, and all these matters were discussed throughout the hill country of Judea. All who heard these things took them to heart, saying, "What then will this child be? For surely the hand of the Lord was with him." The child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the desert until the day of his manifestation to Israel. The Gospel of the Lord.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.